Welcome to In Layman's Term with Guy Nohra. I'm Guy Nohra. We take what we think are very wonkish, complex issues, and we make them easily understandable for intelligent people that just don't have the time, like we do, to research these things. I remember 20 years ago when I was a dad and a full-time job and coaching soccer and all these kind of things. I just had no time to get into some of the issues that were important and that I had to know in order to be a well-informed citizen and well-informed person. So the idea of this show is always to make things understandable and easy to discuss as people go forward after they watch our show. I'm very excited about my guest today, Connor O'Keefe. I love your background, by the way. I'm not gonna steal your thunder, but I love the background, and I'll tell you why. I was in track myself. I was in football myself in high school. I saw you did track in college. I am really I love the fact that you did research on climate and rain and then here you are at George Mason, home of Walter Williams. I love that. So anyway, so all of that being said, why don't we have you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we're just going to delve into today. We're going to talk about tariffs, and I'm trying to demystify as much as I can, and I'm trying to calm people down that just read the headlines. That's really what we're trying to do, and I feel that based on the research I did on you, that we're going to be able to do that. So please tell us about yourself. You can start whenever you want, kindergarten, or you can start in high school, or whenever you want. Tell us about yourself, how you ended up where you are, and what you're working on these days, and we'll take it from there.
All right. Well, as you're sort of picking up there with my background, I have a very varied background. I guess we could start in college. I studied geology in college. Pretty different than what I'm doing right now, but surprisingly relevant in certain ways. Just because I was interested in. I've always loved nature and find the earth fascinating, and so I really enjoyed doing that major. Um, we had sort of a senior capstone research project. It was actually the second half of junior year and senior year, so it was like a year and a half. And I did that on extreme flooding events, and that was just a fascinating thing to dive into deeply. And it really showed me that, to your point about getting past sort of the shock value of the headlines, there was a tremendous amount of control that we had over the deadliness of extreme weather, just in simple things like land use policy. And, what actually is in the floodplain is very important for determining how bad a flood's going to be. Kind of an obvious thing that you're not really thinking about if you're just reading the scariest headlines out there. So that was a fun thing to dive deep into. Before that, I had a video background. I was very interested in video production as a kid and through high school. Didn't really want to do that as a career by itself. I liked it as a craft, but I was kind of too interested in the world to just make videos for other people about anything. So I was kind of finding my way. While I was studying geology, I got completely obsessed with economics. Or the second half of college, fell completely in love with it, and more like the philosophical side of it too. I never was that into math as a young kid. I got more into it later in grad school, but I sort of identified as like somebody who's bad at math. That ended up not being true, but it certainly
I can
felt true at the
relate.
time. Yeah, and I could not stand math class. Um, the economics programs in school didn't really draw me because it felt like they sort of sucked all the joy out of economics. It was this beautiful body of knowledge that just fascinated me, unlike anything I had ever encountered. And economics classes were just like kind of the opposite of that. So I didn't pivot my major. I finished studying geology. Very happy I did that. But then after I graduated in 2019. So kind of went out into the world trying to figure out what I'm going to do. And then the pandemic hits like almost immediately. So that sort of got me reflecting and thinking back. I was like, I um, am still really into this video stuff. I'm obviously really obsessed with economics, I wonder if there's a way I can kind of combine that. I thought that, especially during the pandemic, the best way forward, based on my interest, was to go get a degree in economics. So I ended up going and getting my master's in economics at the time, but sort of held on to that video production side of things as well. And then found my way through, some very fortunate circumstances. I was in the right place at the right time. Got talking to some people here at the Mises Institute, where I work now. And the Mises Institute is an organization that teaches about and advocates for what's called the Austrian School of Economics. It's a school of economic thought that originated in Austria. It's not really based in Austria anymore. And it is sort of not just the school of economic thought, but the approach to economics that really got me fascinated in it in the first place. And so it was sort of like the organization that I was the most interested in and the most passionate about. And I just happened to get talking to some of them. And it just turned out that with my background in my formal training in economics and some of my video production background and just some other various things, I can meet a lot of needs for them. So they hired me in late 2022 as a video producer who was also going to be writing in my own content. So I started writing articles for our website, Mises.org. And pretty quickly that started turning into what it is essentially now, which is a weekly column. So I write an article every single week. It goes out every Wednesday morning. And as you probably picked up from what I'm talking about, I have a lot of different interests. So I am not a specialist. And so my column, I talking about all sorts of things, foreign policy, economics, everything in between.
I love it.
Yeah, just having a great time doing
So
that.
two quick things. One, where did you grow up? But as important for our audience, when people hear the Austrian School of Economics, someone like me knows. But it'd be great in quick summary, what it means, Fred Hayek and so on and so forth. Got people like us, we're the
Mhm.
wonks, but we want to make sure people understand when they hear that and they can sound smart about it. So, hey, where did you grow up? And then, of course, Austrian School of Economics.
Yeah. So I grew up, I was born in California, Southern California. I actually grew up in the Pacific Palisades, the town that was basically just destroyed by
You want to hear
wildfires
something funny?
early this
I
month.
used to be a junior achievement counselor at Pacific Palisades High,
Really? At
like
Pali
100
High.
years ago.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So you know the area well too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I lived there till I was about 9. So it was like my early childhood. And then my family moved to New Jersey. So that's kind of where I consider myself from is New Jersey, northern New Jersey, Morris County, a town called Madison.
Okay.
That's where I grew up. Went to college in Ohio. So I've kind of been all around, and now I live down here in Auburn, Alabama. So I've bounced
Cool.
around a bit.
All
But
right.
yeah, yeah.
Good.
And so the Austrian school. Like I said, it's a school of thought. Economics has a lot of different schools of thought. There's Keynesianism, Marxism, the Chicago School of Economics. Austrian economics is probably throughout, amongst all those, the most free market school of economic thought. It's very, very skeptical of government intervention in the economy. And it's the reason it sort of was distinguished, it draws back to a series of debates that happened in the 1860s, I want to say, late 1800s, 1870s maybe. I should know that off the top of my head. But anyway, and it was mainly debates between economists in Germany and economists in Austria. And so the German, I guess they're now known as the German Historical School. They had a very different approach to economics. They were a lot more empirical. They were essentially statisticians and kind of had this view that economics is about using statistics to help the state guide the economy in a way that's good for society and good for the state. And the Austrians, which was sort of, the name was given by the Germans. It was sort of this derogatory, like these backwater Austrian weirdos over there. They were a lot more committed to theory. So Austrian economics it is very focused on using logical deduction to try to discover economic law. And economic law is something we see as being, we think of it as something that's a lot closer to something like Euclidean geometry. Like it's a system based on logic that in the same way you wouldn't say, if we run out and measure every right triangle and see if they all actually are 90 degrees, that somehow would disprove
Everything.
Euclidean geometry. Like that's a different thing there,
Yeah.
if we're taking it into the real world. And it's the same kind of thing where like economic law is something that exists in kind of this logical construction. And it's a different thing than like going out and gathering data. That's important too, for sure. And like Austrians are not against using empiricism. It's just that that is a different thing than economic theory. And so, the Austrian School of Economic Thought is very focused on that theory. And obviously, it started in Austria. It's kind of moved over to the United States with, the United States with Ludwig von Mises, who were named after here at the Mises Institute. And then F.A. Hayek was another major Austrian economist. He went to the London School of Economics, and then I think found his way to the U.S. as well. Those are kind of the two titans that sort of moved it out of Austria. And now I'd say it's mostly based in the United States. So even though it's still called the Austrian School, that does confuse a lot of people. But that's sort of a rundown of the history.
That's a great description, and I really like the contrast with what was going on in Germany because obviously centralized control was it's almost endemic to the German way. Yet, and what Marx probably in his old days wrote over there. So it's great explanation. Thank you. I think I appreciate it, and I'm sure our listeners will too. So let's, unless you wanted to add something, let's dive into the issue of the last couple of weeks, which is obviously
Yeah.
tariffs. And I want to I want to talk about them. I read your piece, and I read actually a lot of your colleagues' pieces on them. I want to talk about them in a way. Imagine, the people that are going to be listening to our show, just even from the way we describe it, they're going to say to themselves, all I hear about is how bad they are and how awful they are or how good they are and what a great thing it is and Liberation Day and oh no, Larry Summers and a bunch of other people wrote down things saying that's the worst thing we could have ever done. And then, of course, the idiotic politicians talk about the price of guacamole and so on and so forth. So it's all over, right? And what we want to do is we just want to say, let's explain what they are. Let's explain how we got here. And then, and in my case, even just kind of going a little bit more and talking about if we can predict what's going to happen. Of course, we can't. Nobody ever can predict. But also demystifying a lot of this because uh, the world is strident these days, as you know. This it's always something, and everybody's always jumping very quickly and very defensive. And what I think we should do is we should discuss these issues before we become defensive about them, so that when we're discussing them, we understand what we're arguing over, rather than just, oh, I went to University of Chicago, for instance, and when I hear tariffs, I'm like, oh my God, from day one, they told me tariffs are bad, right? So that's my bias. But of course, I'm looking at the reasoning, and I'm trying to understand the other side and why they're doing what they're doing and how it makes sense. So anyway, so I'm trying to if we so here we are. Most of the world has now been tariffed. But we extended a little bit of time. Interestingly, Mexico and Canada escaped. China is in the middle of the whole thing, and the stock market did its thing. And so I'm the average person here. I'm listening to this on my way to work and back. Uh, what do I come up with, and how do I work backwards to understanding it?
Well, I mean, there's so many different places to start.
Open-ended question. I love those in
Open-ended.
job interviews.
Yeah. Well, I definitely agree with sort of what you're saying, like take a breath, like this is not the end of the world, or both extremes are taking it kind of far, as is what happens with just about any kind of story that starts taking off. This is not the end of the world, and it's not, the beginning of a utopia here in America. It's something in between, and as you picked up on, if you read my articles, I am generally opposed to tariffs. and a lot of my colleagues are here too. At the end of the day, they're import taxes. That's quite literally what they are. I prefer that term. I think calling it something else, calling it a tariff, kind of using this other word, can kind of help us. It can let us forget that at the end of the day, these are, simply taxes. And especially right now, I'm finding that it's allowing a lot of progressives and leftists to kind of, um, avoid making it clear that they're now, for the first time ever, talking about how, there are in fact some bad consequences to tariffs or to taxes. So I prefer calling them import taxes, but that's quite literally what they are. And going back to sort of what I was talking about earlier with the Austrian school, we tend to look at this as stuff. It's like, kind of try to throw everything else to the side and say, what does the economic theory say? What are the laws of economics at work here? And how can we then use that to help us, then look at the real world through this kind of lens of understanding, what's kind of happening below the scenes here. And at the end of the day, like I said, a tariff is a tax that is put on goods that are imported to the United States. And so like any other tax that imparts a cost on, whoever specifically has to pay that tax. In this case, those are the companies that are exporting the goods here to the United States. So from our perspective, it's imports. From their perspectives, it is exports. Ooh, getting tongue twisted. And however, like any other kind of tax, it is not only the person that literally has to pay it that is hit with the consequences of that. And that is something that we have been talking about a lot over the last few weeks, is that there are consequences to these tariffs that will be felt by Americans, by American consumers, and especially American businesses, because that's one little detail that often gets overlooked with this topic, is that we tend to think of tariffs as applying to consumer goods. So like the thing that you buy online that's coming from China or something. And that is the case. But the bulk of what these tariffs are impacting are capital goods. So goods that are coming in that are then used essentially as ingredients to produce things, for American businesses to produce things for American consumers. That's kind of the bulk of what's happening here.
Okay.
And
Connor, if we can divide it up, if we can divide it up in two things so that we can again simplify it as much as we can. There's the consumer, and give me an example of a TV that's made in Korea. What happens there, here, the importer, and obviously Best Buy, and then the consumer. Okay, and then we can get into the business piece, where they have all these supply chains and things that are going into products that are made in the United States. So if we can separate them so that our audience can again, the press doesn't give you this, right? They just tell you tariffs, bam, that's bad, good, bad, whatever. But
right.
for us, let's just help people understand, how that plays, so that they can in their own mind separate these issues, and then on their own they can go research them if they have time, or otherwise we'll make other shows and have more conversations.
Sure. I guess the point I'm making here does actually apply to both. I'm just kind of trying to get to the pure economic effect of them. And so kind of regardless of whether it's a consumer good that somebody's buying directly or if it's used down the road, the effect of it, kind of like the effect of any other kind of tax on something at the point of sale, is that it raises the costs for these producers. And all else being equal, when costs go up a little bit, what that does is it impacts what we call the marginal producers. So the companies that are operating right on the edge, where they're producing something at this price and they're selling it just a little bit higher. And those are the ones that are most directly hurt by the tariff, because that might bring their costs above, how much they're bringing in revenue. And this is a very important point that a lot of people, even people that are very opposed to these tariffs, mistake, is that you'll often hear people say that companies are passing the cost on to consumers. And that's bad economics. That's not actually true. And the reason that's not really actually true is because that's not how prices work. If these companies could just raise their prices and that would just go on to consumers, then they would raise their prices anyway. The point is that they are not able to raise their price without losing business. That's a very important point. So that they are frozen at this point where if they raise their price, they're going to lose business. But their costs are so high that they're barely making any money. If they get if their production prices go up a little, now they might be sent into or put into a position where they're losing money. And if they raise the price to try to accommodate for it, they're going to be losing businesses or going to be losing business because consumers are not willing to pay any more than they were before. The consumer wants and needs here have not changed. So that is the pure economic effect there. And over time, the what that brings about is a shortage because some of these marginal businesses will go out of business, and that means the supply will drop. And when supply drops and all else is equal, that means price goes up. So people aren't necessarily wrong when they say tariffs will increase the prices here at home, but it's not just because these businesses are kicking the cost off to American consumers. It's a little bit more roundabout, and I think that's an important difference to understand because it's not just that all of these businesses are going to be completely fine. That they don't. It's not like they don't care at all if they're getting tariffed because they're just going to kick that off to American consumers. It hurts both the American consumer and the American producer. So that's the economic theory of it. And the important point to kind of what you're picking up on, the fact that that is what economic law says doesn't necessarily mean that like this is something we should avoid doing or not. You kind of then have to take that knowledge and then apply it to the real world, examine our situation and say, okay, because in life sometimes costs are worth paying. And so that I think I still think that diving into the economic theory of it is an important starting point, so that then we can go kind of take a rational look at what's happening, which we could do now, or we could continue to discuss the theory side of it.
Which is a great place for me to give you a little bit of my experience right now as we're speaking about it with tariffs. So I'm on a board of a couple of companies, and one of them is a diagnostic testing company, and one of our manufacturers is from China. So as a venture capitalist, I'm always amazed at at how entrepreneurs adjust. They have an amazing ability to adjust to any outside factors, and I don't know how it applies honestly to the huge companies. I assume they have more resources to adjust and more time to adjust, but our guys are guerrilla warfare. They just adjust immediately. So right now, I have to be careful with confidentiality, but obviously scouring the world for other sources, hoping for the best, but managing for the worst, which means us and China are going to continue to be in some kind of a trade war, and going back to R&D and seeing if there are ways to make things differently so that we can do it all perhaps here, instead of just doing the alpha beta testing here, perhaps we can just move it all here. And then going back to the clients and saying we'll split the difference. And of course, going back to the supplier and saying we'll split the difference. So what is, let's say, 50 cents per cartridge is now really 15 cents at the end of the day of increased pricing per cartridge. So everywhere across the chain of this whole product, we're trying to squeeze things here and there just so that we make it as easy for everybody in the loop. By the way, including the guys who are selling it to us, from China. So I'm hoping that this kind of an approach is going to be taken by most American businesses, and hence, to your point of that marginal, I'm a guy who, like, everything I do, I like to live by the margin, because in venture capital, it could be literally five patients that go the right way or the wrong way out of 2,000, and you either get a multi-billion drug approved or not approved. Talk about margin, right? The margin you're referring to, that margin of error, but I know. So So do you think American ingenuity could address the issue that you're bringing up as far as yes, there's going to be increase in pricing, probably there'll be less supply, and a lot of our manufacturers are going to feel some of the pinch here. And this is and we're getting into the details, but I think that's important.
Yeah, well, to your point, the market as a process is very resilient, and it's always kind of looking and adapting because there's no static state in the economy. Everything's always changing all the time. And yeah, this is a big change that kind of dramatically hit everybody, or not everybody, but like a huge portion of the economy at the same time. So it's a very visible thing. But to your point, like people are looking to optimize every single day, and this is just sort of making that process more visible. And so I'm not one of these. I am still opposed to this tariff strategy, and we can get more into why later. But I'm not trying to make the point that like this is going to be an economic disaster that we will like never escape from. The point is that the economic theory shows us that all else being equal, supply will be a little bit lower than it would have been absent these tariffs, and therefore prices will be a little bit higher than they would have been absent that. Like to your point, that gets a little bit messy in the real world because there is, possibility that, like what you're talking about, where people are sort of the tariffs are waking some people up to like, hey, we should go re-examine our costs to see if we could bring those down a little bit. Um, there could be an effect where the tariff will sort of shake some people awake to do that. However, the people that are actually affected by the tariff, or the firms that are actually affected by the tariffs, in the way I was describing earlier, are the people that are not able to do that. The people on the margin that aren't able to raise their price or lower their cost without losing business one way or the other. So yes, like the pure economic theory doesn't probably translate 100% because you have the people that are not sort of operating at the optimum or close to the optimum, and this might compel some of them to do that. But for the people, for the firms that are the ones I was focusing on earlier, it's kind of the same. It's the inverse of the price thing. If they were able to lower their costs and therefore expand their profit earlier, if this was a super common thing with all these marginal firms, like I'm skeptical of the idea that you have all these marginal firms that could be making more profits, but they just haven't for some reason. I think the ones that are affected are the ones that have basically no room to move one way or the other.
Yeah, yeah, I think that yeah, that makes that you're right. I understand what you're saying, and there are a lot of people a lot of firms that are going to be in that position. What do you say? Um, I, I'm 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 reluctant to get into uh, the rhetoric because I really want us to focus on some of the quality um, of this conversation. Tell me your thoughts about. I saw criticism about the formula that we used and to use tariffs. So um, and I know it. You probably know it better than I do. Can you explain to us uh, the formula and why the administration decided to use that formula?
So I have not actually taken a deep dive into that formula, but my understanding of it, based on what I have read about it, is that they were focusing on trying to, and you could correct me, but they were focusing on trying to optimize or to, I guess, better the trade deficit
Yeah.
between countries. That was sort of the target. So even though this was sort of presented in some ways, like with the press conference and with some of the administration's rhetoric beforehand, as kind of a retaliatory strategy, that it was about um, other countries have tariffs on us, so we're going to put tariffs on them. And then, there's different schools of thought as to like whether that's a negotiation tactic or if it's like they're benefiting from putting tariffs on us, and so we'll benefit from putting tariffs on them. But it seems like with that formula that and the specific tariff rates that they chose for all these different countries, that it was a lot more about trying to orchestrate a different trade deficit between us and a number and well all these other countries that were on the list. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so there's a numerator, denominator, and then they multiply by half, and then that's your tariff number. And
Yeah.
if you right, so it's imports divided by deficit or vice versa times one half, and that's how you end up with the percentage. And I was always, I'm curious. I wish I mean, someday maybe I'll interview somebody who was in that room
Mhm.
to understand why that formula was used, because the formula has been attacked by other economists just based on the actual the way they try to do it rather than yes or no on tariffs. It's like, well, I
Mhm.
would have done it differently and for this reason. And I wanted to see if in your mind, so if the White House called you up and said, Connor, we need a formula here for the deficit. Your first answer is going to be, I don't do that because I'm a Austrian economist. It's going to say, serve your country, okay? We know you love your country. Serve your country. What? How would there be a formula you would use?
I guess my perspective is, I mean, sort of to what you're saying, is a bit different than I think most of the people that were in that room. And specifically when it comes to trade deficits, to me, trade deficits are kind of, at least right now for the right, that hasn't always been for the right, but they're to the right what like income inequality or inequality generally is for the left. And that to me, it's like, it is not something that necessarily says that something shady is happening here, but it also could be evidence that something shady is happening. So just like with the left will point to, some dramatic inequality between two people, and to them that's enough to say, something's wrong here. We need to go fix this. But that could just be because this person, is a lot more skilled or works a lot harder. This person's very lazy. There are reasons that that could have come about in a way that's fair and not just. And it's the same thing with trade deficits, as I see it. That at the end of the day, a trade deficit is just about the difference between imports and exports. And if we drill down back down to the economic theory, my favorite place, then in a lot of ways, trade deficits are kind of this sort of constructed thing because what an exchange is at the end of the day, it's not saying that if I have two apples and you have an orange and we trade those things, an exchange is not saying that two apples equals one orange. It's not about the equality between those two things. What it's demonstrating is that I valued, well, what did I have, the apples or the orange? I valued what you had more than I valued what I have, and vice versa. So it's about we subjectively valued these things differently. And so if we were to make that trade and then say, oh, there's a deficit because of this, that wouldn't really mean anything because we both feel that we were made better off by that trade. However, if you tried to run a trade deficit in your household for the rest of the time, you're going to be buying more than you're bringing in income, and so you'll eventually go bankrupt. So I understand the aversion some people have to this idea that our economy is essentially buying way more stuff than we're selling. It sounds like a household that's going to go bankrupt at some point. However, and it gets very complicated when you start bringing in a lot of things like global reserve currency and stuff like this. This could be a series of episodes on its
Yeah.
own. However, um, to me, I think it's very important to distinguish between is the trade deficit there because of what people value, what people are freely trying to buy and sell, and is the trade deficit the way it is because of constraints that either government is putting on some aspect of the trade happening between those countries. I am all for the whatever outcome people freely choose, as long as it's voluntary and making everybody better off. When governments get involved, however, then they can start to hamper trade in certain ways. And it's kind of like going back to like how inequality can sometimes it is true that if somebody is doing a lot better than somebody else, it's because they unfairly took from somebody else, or they sort of constructed a system that benefited them in a way that was unjust. And I think you definitely get that a lot on when it comes to global trade. And I guess one of my critiques of the administration's approach, which is common, but I still think flawed, is that they don't distinguish between that. There's no attempt to kind of figure out is the, are we being ripped off here, or do people just value things from this country a lot and want to do a lot of trade? And so I guess I kind of reject this whole idea that we need to come up with a formula that we're going to uniformly apply to try to construct, through the tax system, a better outcome. I think that's a very flawed way of trying to fix the problems that we have
Okay,
on
so
on the trade front.
I think we're going kind of like, I like the direction we're going. So if, fair trade versus free trade. Obviously, you're a free trader. Um, if I took the other side, I would say, yeah, I get it, and I get everything that you're saying, but let's talk about fair trade. And if we use your analogy, um, two apples for one orange. So let's say the group that is, doing the two apples for one orange decides that they're also going to uh, uh, grow a whole bunch of oranges and sell them below the price of your orange at the point at which you don't make oranges anymore because it's not viable financially to make oranges. And that's kind of that's not free trade now. That's just predatory practices by, again, our favorite, China, right? Um, so do you buy the argument that you just took away all of my oranges by unfair trade practices, and consequently I've got to grow oranges again, and the way I'm going to do that is by making your oranges cost three times more than they did after you put my orange business out of business.
Yeah,
So
I tend to I tend to look at that as something. I think that is what you're describing there is something that happens in the economy all the time. People are always getting priced out or outcompeted in certain ways. And I don't view that as in itself an issue, even when it's happening across borders. And I understand the perspective you're putting forward. That's obvious. You're voicing a very common opinion there. I think that specifically there, um, that because the economy is really at the end of the day just this huge process to produce goods and services that end consumers want. That what you're describing is a natural part of that market process, and of course, it's terrible for anybody to get priced out or outcompeted. And yes, like I would not be happy that I can't sell oranges anymore because somebody came in and started selling oranges that were a lot cheaper that other people valued more than the oranges I was, or that they wanted to exchange with you more than they wanted to exchange with me with my high priced oranges. However,
and subsidized oranges that are subsidized by the other side. So they're selling them below cost, right? I mean that's kind of how this all of these countries that played these games, it was
mhm.
all industrial subsidies in order to uh, make the price low long enough until the other person's is out of business, and then the price catches up back up, and it comes back to where roughly to where it was before. So there is a gaming taking place by the other person, by the person who just destroyed your orange business. So again,
Uh-huh.
in your world, it's just a hey, I just make oranges better than you do, so you got to buy my oranges. In this world, I actually predatorily and through government subsidies made your oranges less worth so that my oranges can come in, and then at some point I bring up the price of oranges because you're gone.
Yeah,
So it,
I understand that difference. I guess when it comes down to it, having tried to dig into the history of it, I haven't seen a lot of evidence that that is it was. I think you're describing dumping is the term for it. I haven't seen a lot of evidence of the second part of that. That then they bring the price back up to whatever the market price was before, whatever I was selling oranges at, and I'm that uh, everybody who was selling oranges before is unable to come back into the market when it's right back at the point it was before. A similar argument is made a lot about domestically about monopolies. This idea that monopolies will come in, not monopolies yet, but big businesses will come in, charge really low prices, drive all their competitors out of business, and then when all their competitors are gone, they're a monopoly, and they'll jack the price up to whatever they want. And it's like, yeah, that kind of makes sense in theory, but the history doesn't really show that. There's not evidence of that happening. And I think a big reason, to the point we were talking about earlier, how much everything is changing in the economy all the time. People are always scouring for any opportunity to start, producing something different or producing something differently. Any kind of area where there might be an opportunity to come into a market. This stuff is constantly in flux. And so this idea that I understand like the dumping thing from the producer's perspective. Yeah, like that's really frustrating to have some other government, tax their own citizens to then subsidize a price going, below the market rate that you then have to compete with. However, there is also the other side of it, which is that is essentially a gift from the Chinese government to American consumers who are now getting much cheaper oranges in our example, but whatever the goods might be. So there is another side of it too. I am also uncomfortable with the idea of government coming in and messing with the market at all. But being that we're talking from the perspective of Americans who are not, involved at all in the decisions of the Chinese government, I'm sort of looking at their actions as a given, and it's like, what could we do taking that as a given? And I don't see that as if Americans are getting a bunch of less expensive goods. I don't necessarily see that as a big tragedy. It would be if if we had no manufacturing anymore and then they jack their prices up. But I don't see a lot of evidence that is a serious threat in the real world.
Again, and the reason why I enjoy this conversation here is because I expect my listeners to actually take what you just said and say, well, let's look at steel. Was there dumping? Was there not dumping? If there was dumping, was it a gift to us that we pay at the end of the day less for steel, and how does that? And of course, I will challenge my listeners to also put into this whole thing the whole job situation. I don't want to debate jobs, but the fact that we gutted our manufacturing as a result of some of these practices, not we gutted, the manufacturing got gutted as part of, I just want people to either, when we get feedback about our conversation, if people say, well, what about jobs? What about taxes? What about, what about the deficit? Then we can probably have another show where we can discuss these. But to me, I think what I'm trying to do is through your answers, have people raise their own questions so that they can, and in their free time, at least we've opened up a little bit their minds into what's happening and how they can look at things. So let me ask you then, time flies when you're having fun. Let me ask you, so what happens from here? So some people are saying the greatest negotiator in the history of presidents is just going to use these tools as a negotiation tool in order to help these deficits and make people perhaps invest more in the US, but not necessarily do a trade per trade type of a situation. So in your example, and maybe it's not oranges, but now everybody's gonna give us ways to make persimmons or or lychee or what you call it, right? So what do you see? What do no one knows. Having been a venture capitalist, when you're the most powerful person in the room, you can afford to take any stance you want and then back out. So I'd walk into a board meeting and say, we're not selling this company to Pfizer just because I don't want to, the price is not good enough. And then, 2 hours later, they've convinced me that we can get enough up front. And so now I'm saying, well, okay, maybe we can talk to Pfizer. Okay, this is just an example. So what do you think happens here, knowing that we have in my mind, an amazing negotiator at the top, who that is I call it chairman prerogative, CEO prerogative. They run the show. Everybody else is support. So anyway, so how do you see this?
I find it very hard to predict. To your point, it's difficult to predict the future anyway. But with something like this, there's just so many moving pieces. I think the thing that I'm uh, trying to really come to understand myself is it to me it's still somewhat unclear what the administration's specific goals are here. I think that's one issue they've run into is that um, and Trump I don't know it you can parse his language all day, but especially with his team, it seems like he has different factions around him that agree that we should have tariffs, but they seem to disagree over what ends those tariffs should be, a means toward. And so you definitely have some who seem to be hardcore protectionists that think that having tariffs will be good for the American economy and that it will, bring back jobs, it will revitalize manufacturing, and make us wealthier. And like, okay, it's as you can probably guess, I disagree with that, but that's a philosophy that a lot of people have, and part of that is okay. Well, then the tariffs will have to be implemented, and they'll have to stick around for a long time for those effects to really come into place, especially if you're talking about businesses moving operations to the United States. For some, especially giant like manufacturing businesses, that's a really long time scale. That kind of decision has to be made on. So the important one of the important aspects with that kind of approach is being very clear, very definite, and sticking to what you put into practice. On the other side is this idea of tariffs as negotiation, um, as a means to negotiate new trade arrangements with different countries. And in that case, it's sort of this tool of, hey, we just put, an import tax on you. How about you come talk to us and see if we can kind of work out a new deal? I'm inclined to think that's what Trump sort of prefers because that seems to be his whole thing is making deals, art of the deal. Yeah, I agree. He's very, very good at that. And it seems like that's what brings him enjoyment. Not just on tariffs, but on all sorts of aspects of his presidency. He's trying to get in there, foreign policy, obviously. He wants to get in there and make deals. Like, okay, there is that whole approach, but that is made a lot more difficult if you give mixed messaging as to what will happen if the other side, does X, Y, or Z. Some of the messaging of the administration has been, has suggested that if they start dropping their tariffs, that we might start dropping the tariffs that we put on them. And other rhetoric from the administration has suggested the opposite, that it doesn't matter what they do, we're going to keep the tariffs on them. And that seems to hamper the negotiation process. And so I guess as we're sort of moving forward in time, I think we're going to get more clarity between those two extremes. I don't think it's one extreme or the other. And there's some gray area in there in terms of like using the idea that they might be permanent tariffs as a negotiation tactic. Like it's not a binary one or the other. But I think as we get more clarity, it'll be easier to see, or it'll be easier to start predicting. Are these going to be something that we're going to be, dealing with the consequences of good or bad? I think they're bad, but for a long time, or is this the type of thing where a couple of months or a couple of years down the road, a lot of these tariffs are going to be gone, and we're going to have a very different trade system based on what the president negotiated. Those are two very different outcomes. It's kind of unclear to me right now where we fall between those two extremes, but that's the dynamic that I'm watching closest as I'm trying to navigate this with everybody else.
And I think it's a great perspective because you're not, again, people either for political reasons or just because that's how the world thinks, they want to panic one way or the other. I think your view, what you said was perfect, which is we don't know. Let's just see what's going to happen here. From my perspective, because I've been a venture capitalist my whole life, I like disruption. And I think every system that exists, if it exists for more than 50 years, it should be disrupted. Nothing works great for 50 years the way the world works. So I'm kind of with the caveat that I really care about people and what happens to people worldwide, but of course, first Americans. I'm intrigued at how this plays out from a disruption perspective, because what is happening is there is a fundamental shift in world trade that could occur as a result of this. And again, as a guy who loves disruption, I mean, look, we disrupted real estate, we disrupted taxis, we disrupted telecom, we've disrupted everything, except we haven't disrupted, government, which maybe we might this time,
Yeah.
and we don't disrupt these like big worldwide, UN and WHO and so on, and
Hmm.
who's institutions by definition, need to be disrupted every 50, 100 years, right? I mean, so for me, it's kind of like it's watchful waiting, we say in medicine. You make sure you make nothing worse, but you're watching, hopefully, that this tumor doesn't grow, So again, watchful waiting. And we'll see what happens. And I really appreciated your time and really your demeanor and your patience, because I know how you guys on your side, the Austrian school. I know where your minds are at, and you'll probably look at this world and you're like shaking your head every day when you wake up. Yet you were patient enough with me and with our audience that actually they can take something out of this. And if 10 people take out of this what the Austrian school is, to me, that's a success, because what's going to save this country is going to be an educated populace in everything. And so, pleasure. And I was going to make a quip early on about your name and go, "Are you Irish?" But I'll do it at the end.
I am indeed. Connor Morin O'Keefe is my full name. So yes,
Okay.
and I look the part.
Absolutely. Um, we used to have a house in Ireland in County Kerry, so I knew it pretty well. Many Guinnesses and
Oh yeah.
Irish football. Well, thank you so much, and please stay in touch. I'd love to stay in touch with you. Are you guys you're at George Mason?
No,
Is
no,
that
we
where
are
you're
in
based?
Auburn, Alabama.
You're in
Yeah.
Alabama?
Yeah, so
Okay.
we're far outside the Beltway on purpose.
Sometimes,
Yeah.
very smart. Sometimes I have board meetings and that take me closer to you if they come in that direction. If I'm in Reno, but I go to Vegas all the time. If you have conferences down there, let me know. Let's catch up.
Yeah, awesome. Fantastic. Well,
All
we
right.
and we have a fantastic campus here if you ever
Okay.
are in the
I'd love to.
area.
I'd love
Yeah,
to come by. I
fantastic.
think again, I tend to be, I'm a Chicago guy, obviously, and we're probably our two schools are the closest. If you look at on the
Yeah.
spectrum of
Yeah.
marks to
That's right.
you guys.
Yeah.
So, all right. So, thank you so much, and have a great rest of the week and a great rest of the day.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for
Okay.
having me.